Hello, everybody. I guess I kind of in the right if I want to borrow a little introduction. Hello, all my gentle and modern apes. Today I'm going to be talking about the heat problem. And I've mentioned in a couple other videos that I wanted to do a video just specifically about the heat problem. So that's going to be this is going to be one of those videos. This is a video where I just introduced the heat problem because I didn't know about the heat problem. I had to learn about it from people on Facebook and YouTube and stuff like that. And I was introduced to it by the old Gutsick Gibbon, Erica, aka Gutsick Gibbon. That's her YouTube channel. I recommend her many times on this channel. She's one of my favorite YouTubers. I put her in the top 3 on the subject specifically of evolution versus creationism. I would put the top 3 as her, Erica, aka Gutsick Gibbon. My number 2 would be Aaron Ra. His channel is just called Aaron Ra. And then my third favorite would be Dr. Dan from Creation Myths. And I like all 3 of these people, not just because they have an incredible grasp on both evolution and creationism, but because they're just like super nice people. Like I have met pretty much all of those people except for Erica directly now. And they've all been like just unbelievably sweet, unbelievably kind, amazing people. And I've met people who know Erica and they have all said the same about her, that Erica is super cool too. So I have no doubt that's completely true. And you kind of get the sense of that in her videos. She just seems like a pretty, joyful, interesting, nice person. But she made several videos about this thing called the heat problem, which I discovered at the same time that I was kind of, as a result of parallel thinking, kind of figuring this problem out myself. Because I asked a question to creationists. And the question was something like, I told them, okay, let's think about it this way. Say I want to accept your concept about how the world developed, right? Say I want to join your team and be a young Earth creationist. So basically, we're saying that like volcanic, meteorological, oceanic, tectonic, like tons of development has happened in just 6 to 12,000 years. Like if you're going to be a young Earth creationist, it is inescapable that you're going to have to claim that all of this development happened in a much shorter time than what conventional science says. And I didn't even realize what I was stumbling upon as I was asking that question. I kind of started to work it out a little bit. Like I knew about atomic decay, but I didn't really put it together. Like in the back of my mind, I was kind of thinking about it, but like that wasn't the direct point of the question. The direct point, which is part of what the heat problem is, it's just a development problem. The question I was specifically asking was just about development in general, like, all of this speciation, all of these different, arrays of organisms, these ancestral basal arrays of organisms that exist within the layers of the earth, they all developed in that period of time, which, you probably start to see how creationists, if that is their argument, they not only have to accept evolution, they have to say that evolution is way more powerful than any of the data indicates. They basically have to say that not only does speciation happen, but after the flood, when the array of animals that got off the boat and landed on land, that they speciated incredibly swiftly. Like you would have to have multiple speciations per day for us to have all the organisms that exist in deeper layers of the geological column and all modern organisms develop in that span of time. There's all kinds of issues that end up surfacing, materializing, crystallizing as a result of making that denominator in that rate problem something way, way smaller than billions of years. And the heat problem, I think, is one of the best examples of that. Here, let's let Erica herself describe the heat problem for you guys, because she's an expert on this. So we'll let her explain it, and then I'll talk about it myself a little more and what it means to me. So here we go, Erica, aka Guts Gibbon.
There are many reasons why we know the Earth is very ancient and all life descends from a common ancestor. Likewise, there are nearly endless reasons as to why we know that alternative ideas, like those of young Earth creationism, are entirely untenable. I spend a lot of time arguing with young Earth creationists both online and in my real life at my real job, and as a result, I've come to the conclusion that my favorite argument to use against the idea is that of the heat problem. Those of you who have followed this channel.
So, like, when I posed this question, I was getting responses from creationists, and they were really dodgy and, kind of wriggly about how they would answer. And it felt to me like they were kind of chewing around something, like they wanted to answer, but at the same time, like I think they might have like felt like I was trying to trap or bait them, which I was to an extent. I'm trying to get you to say, yes, all that development happened in 6 to 12,000 years. At which point I would ask, okay, so what is the planet going to look like in 500 million years? Which obviously is going to be very different. There's going to be a completely different array of species. There's going to be whole new clades of life that don't exist currently. And it's funny because it causes them cognitive dissonance. But what I didn't know is I think creationists actually know about the heat problem better than counter apologists like me, which is why Erica's awesome for talking about the heat problem and having so many videos about it. Because it is such a great problem. And in the comments of the post where I asked that question, we're saying all this development happened in 6,000 years. Somebody actually commented, don't forget about the heat problem. And I was like, what is this guy talking about? Because I was kind of going through the parallel thinking of, I'm not even mentioning the atomic decay rates in the question. They must have thought I was baiting them to slap them with the atomic decay rates. No, I was going to slap you with the cognitive dissonance aspect of it. But the atomic decay rates are huge. They're way bigger than I thought they were when I was first kind of like wrestling with this idea. And Erica's going to explain why here for us. Thank you, Erica.
For any modicum of time have heard of the heat problem before, and that's probably in part because I've intentionally tried to popularize it. This is because it's such a comically lethal blow to young Earth creationism that I think it should be in more people's back pocket when they're talking to friends and relatives about why they might be young Earth creationists. There are many other bodies of data that are problematic for young Earth creationism, but I like the heat problem in particular because it's actually preclusionary and in such a clear way.
There are so many data sets contradict and preclude young Earth creationism. Plankton, stratification, limestone formation, biomass. The number of data sets and issues that preclude young Earth creationism are massive, and Erica talks about them a lot on her channel. If you want more in-depth detail about all these data sets, that she has a whole series of videos about them. But I like the heat problem the best, precisely for the reasons she's talking about here. It really is a strong knockdown, drag-out argument. If you can't answer this, your ideas are still implausible.
So today, I thought that we would look at the heat problem, but specifically look at it in the realm of creation science. Creation science is the pseudoscientific field that is propped up by degree-holding creationists. Sometimes they're young Earth creationists, sometimes old Earth creationists, and sometimes they're even intelligent design proponents. But the overall goal of creation science is to try to show that their ideas hold scientific merit and indeed deserve to stand toe-to-toe with conventional science.
And this is something we were just talking about in another video, either yesterday or earlier today. I remember I was discussing with somebody, I don't remember exactly who, but you'll notice a trend of creation scientists talking outside of their discipline. Like, you'll have a creation scientist who has a degree in, geology, but they talk about nothing but biology. Or you'll have a creation scientist who has a degree in physics, but they talk about nothing but biology, you know? Or my favorite is so many creation scientists have degrees in theology or philosophy, and they act like that gives them scientific understanding, like it gives them scientific credentials. It does not. A philosophy degree is not transferable to other topics, and philosophers are some of the worst people about this. Absolutely, philosophers think they are qualified to talk about freaking anything, and it drives me crazy. Philosophy is about three things: knowledge, beauty, morality. If it's not one of those three things, you're probably not super qualified to talk about it as a philosopher. And science is definitely not one of them.
What it really is, in my personal opinion, is typically three evangelicals in a lab coat that are masquerading as scientists. The reason I hold this opinion is because in the many years that I've been operating this channel and talking with creationists of all stripes, the vast majority of them put forward work that is not very rigorous and often unempirical. It is particularly interesting to me that a lot of these young earth creationist scientists practicing creation science do fine work when it is in the realm of conventional secular science, but the moment it dips a toe into proving or supporting young earth creationism, the robusticity of it all really takes a nosedive. To be abundantly clear, this does not mean that every creationist, no matter what variety of creationists they are, is a pseudoscience. I'm simply saying that it is my opinion that the body of creation science tends to be absolutely riddled with bad methods, incorrect data, and unfortunately, sometimes intentional deceit. So you might be wondering, well, how do they support creationism? Because typically, when you think about creationism, you only think about their attempts to bash evolution or the ancient age of the earth. What about their own models? And typically, creationist models, namely young earth creationist models, attempt to take biblical events and show support for them scientifically. One of the most popular of these events to attempt to support is, of course, Noah's Ark.
And this is huge. This is a huge aspect of creationism, and it's probably one of the few ways that the general populace is somewhat aware that it exists. You know, kind of festering underneath various rocks and dark outcroppings and corners, like conspiracy theories tend to do. People in general are aware that there's things like the Ark Encounter Museum. They know that that exists here in America. I think they imagine that it exists, but that there's not a lot of like support and attendance there. But that unfortunately is not necessarily true. I mean, attendance is low, thank goodness, but there's still plenty of people going there. And there's still plenty of creationists in our country too. And they're very, very strongly mobilized and organized. Creationists have a solidarity amongst themselves that atheists, being as we are of highly diverse philosophies and worldviews, we just don't kind of have that kind of cohesion, I feel like. Yeah, old earth creationists think young earth creationists, both of them think each other are wrong, but they'll happily team up to take on somebody like me to challenge me and tell you that I'm incorrect about the things that I say. They won't focus on each other as much as long as they have me to attack, you know, if that makes sense. So yes, there is that level of solidarity there.
Now, if you're new to the channel, that might have been quite jarring to hear, but
Yeah.
it does kind of make sense, right? Noah's Ark is the story of a worldwide flood. If the Bible is literally true and claims that a literal flood did indeed happen, which I also don't hold to, I don't think that's hermeneutically sound, but if you do hold to that, then of course that support should exist in the earth in fields like geology, physics, biology, paleontology, and much, much more. Creation scientists, like those that work at Answers in Genesis, CMI, or ICR, often spend a lot of their time trying to form a coherent model that makes Noah's Ark make sense. Usually, this is done by incorporating several different fields, like those of geology, paleontology, and physics as well as astronomy in order to ground the idea of a worldwide flood in science. The idea
And if Noah's Ark is what they're going with, they're up against it long before you ever introduce the heat problem. There's so many logistical, statistical, logical problems with the idea that there was a genocidal superstorm that knocked out pretty much every species on the planet except two of every kind that this one really old guy and his family collected on a boat. There's so many. What about, like, I mean, you could go completely obscure with it. Xylophagy. Xylophagy alone makes that impossible. There are species of elephants, beavers, cubs, bears, whales, insects, termites, ants, beetles. There are countless species that their primary dietary nutritional substance that they go to for sustenance is wood. And the Bible says that the ark was made of something called gopher wood, which is never really made clear exactly what gopher wood is. But if it's good enough for the gophers, I imagine it's good enough for termites, elephants, whatever wood-eating species there are on this boat to chow down on. And it's not like they have to eat a considerable amount of this boat to cause issues, but there will be a lot of them that eat wood, that survive on wood, and you're not going to be able to completely stop them from chowing down on any part of the ship whatsoever. And all that's necessary is for one of them to just eat a tiny hole in it, and then the whole thing sinks. Did you bring enough food to feed them? Enough food to make repairs if they do eat holes in your ship? Then we have more mass issues, right? We've got a biomass problem. We've got a food problem. We've got the xylophagy problem. That's before we even get into the heat problem, which he still hasn't explained yet. So let's continue.
is that this would give them some legitimacy. If they could show that there's even an inkling of a chance that Noah's Ark actually happened, well, that's a whole lot of support for the literal interpretation of the Bible as seen by a young earth creationist. It doesn't really matter to them that every other scientist that isn't a young earth creationist disagrees with them and sees no evidence that a globe spanning flood that occurred 4,400 years ago is responsible for the entire geologic column, all the fossils within that column, the positioning of the continents, and radiometric decay dates.
And that's interesting because I find that their method of dealing with that fact is just changing the story. Oh, it wasn't a worldwide flood. Oh, it didn't happen that long. Oh, it was only a local flood. It was only this kind of flood. It was only this, or it was only that. They change the biblical story, and then they turn around and they scream at everybody how they're not good enough Christians because they aren't believing in the literal biblical story. It's kind of hypocritical, and it's interesting.
They want young earth creationism to be true, and Ken Ham simply needs to justify the big ass boat that he built in the middle of Kentucky. As a result, flood models that creation scientists propose aim to make sense of conventional science in the context of the global flood, namely that of the geologic column. Now, the geologic column spans all of Earth's history, 4.5 billion years worth, with complex life dominating the past 500 million years. Creationists generally propose that at least the last 500 million years worth of geology was due to the flood. So we are cramming 500 million years worth of processes into a single year, which is the amount of time that it took for the Noah's Ark event to occur. This includes, of course, radioactive decay, the movement of the continents, impact events, sedimentation and compaction, deposition, the life cycles of all the organisms living during this vast time period, and much, much more. There is a caveat here, though, and that has to do with radioactive decay. You see, creationists need to explain the radioactive dates that we have for the age of the Earth today, and so as a result, some young Earth creationists propose that the past 4.5 billion years worth of decay happened during the flood and was accelerated, while others only propose that the past 500 million years worth of accelerated decay happened during the flood. This is, of course, the flood model. It is a model that attempts to explain the state of things currently through the lens of the Noachian deluge. And the most popular flood model is that proposed by John Baumgartner, catastrophic plate tectonics, or CPT. This is actually the most popular flood model. Catastrophic plate tectonics goes something like this. Before the flood, Earth was a single supercontinent. Answers in Genesis, which accepts CPT, proposes that this was Rodinia. Then, during the flood, plate tectonics occurred, but catastrophically, or on fast forward. Slabs of oceanic crust broke loose and subducted along the continental margins, which lowered the viscosity of the mantle, leading to meters per second runaway subduction. This means the continental plates were moving faster than a race car. During this process, Baumgartner also proposes that the Earth's magnetic field rapidly reversed several times. The massive amounts of heat caused huge amounts of water to evaporate into steam, which then caused a global rain. Flood basalts erupted all over the planet, and the lighter mantle material of the new ocean floors made them rise, allowing oceans to flood the continents. The flood carried and redistributed the sediments, effectively creating the geologic column of the past 500 million years. At some point during the flood, much like the sped up movement of the continents, nuclear decay also accelerated and is responsible for all our modern nuclear dates, reading ages that are significantly older than 6,000 years. The process finally slowed down once nearly all the old ocean floor had been subducted, and today's rates are a consequence of that. Subsequent cooling of the ocean basins caused them to sink away to their current position, the water recedes, Noah's Ark lands on Mount Ararat, and life begins anew. Now, if all of that sounds really silly, like it doesn't make very much sense at all, then you're not alone. CPT is espoused, however, by all of the major young earth creationist organizations, despite the fact that it is plagued with more holes than a trypophobia museum.
So let's stop. Let's slow down a second. She's talking about the nuclear decay rate. So what she's talking about is something called unstable isotopes. Now, an isotope is an element. It's a version of an element that has a different number of particle elements inside of its nucleus, and because of that, they're unstable. Their nucleus is going to gradually decay. It's going to alter and lose, protons, neutrons, whatever it is, until it becomes a stable atomic nucleus that has a charge matching the electrons in its outer valence shell and everything like that. So what happens is you have things like carbon 14 that decays from the unstable carbon element into a stable carbon element, like I think it's called carbon 12. So think of modern decay rates as like this level of water that has filled this bottle here, right? No matter how long the universe has been around, this level of water doesn't change at all, regardless of how long the universe has existed. And that's the same case for nuclear decay, for unstable isotopes decaying. There is a certain level of decay in them, regardless of how old the universe is. The question is, what timeline makes sense for that nuclear decay to occur? So, like, if you just added a couple drops at a time into this over billions of years, it would add up slowly and it wouldn't make a big difference. But if you tried to really increase the rate, we got major problems now, don't we? Yeah, see, that's a big problem. So it doesn't really work. And now I have to dry off my laptop because I got water all over it. I'm back. I really hope I didn't harm my laptop there to make that point. But I think it made the point well. It demonstrated that when you change the rate of deposition, it really causes problems, especially if that rate is something that produces a measurable runoff, which atomic decay does. It produces heat. So she's talking about the fact that current heat decay levels exist, regardless of what you put as the denominator in that rate problem. Those modern decay rates are what they are. If you try and fit them into a 6,000 year timeline, it ends up being a phenomenal amount of heat. We're just getting into the meat of it here, so I'll let her keep going.
In fact, there are several open questions that immediately come to mind. The flood allegedly starts because the oceanic crust splits open. Well, what caused this to occur? What triggers the rapid subduction, where the plates are moving at race car speeds atop the mantle? How does Baumgartner suppose the viscosity of the mantle changes to avoid lethal amounts of heat from the friction alone? Why do we have more sediment on the continents than in the seas, where the water supposedly flowed back as the oceans receded? Why don't we see any evidence of this massive water flow back to the sea as we do for localized megafloods like those seen in the Scablands? Why are the animals and plants fossilized in evolutionary order when they occupy similar niches? How does this model tackle coral clocks, limestone deposition rates, planktonic biomass, and the evidence from the orbital monsoon hypothesis? None of these questions have answers, but worse yet is the issue of heat. Hey, that's the entire point of the video. It turns out a lot of things release heat, like radioactive decay, impact events, limestone formation, magma hardening, continental drift, and many.
The continental drift one is especially important because, as you'll remember, earlier in the video, she showed that diagram of all the different, continents and countries on Earth drifting around the planet at like race car speeds. Have you ever seen a race car like rev its engine up and the tires start spinning? What happens? It produces a lot of heat, right? The tires start smoking because all the friction causes so much heat that it vaporizes the rubber. The same thing happens if you're talking about an entire ass landmass, you guys. It doesn't become less friction because it's not a race car. It becomes a lot more friction. And that contributes a significant amount of heat to this heat problem that they're going to have to solve.
Many more. So that's just a little sampling of some things that are going to release a lot of heat. If you take 4.5 to 500 million years worth of those processes and cram it into a single year of the flood. And I would like to look at how much heat they release specifically in the context of CPT. Let's start with radioactive decay. Radiometric dating, which is
I think CPT is one of the funny ways they try to cope with the problem, especially because CPT, as far as I can tell, just makes the problem worse. That steam is going to create heat. The subduction is going to create heat. The water pushing up from the fountains of the depth is going to create heat. It seems like it introduces more heat than it rejects or, can accommodate for. Which is really ironic.
Which is rooted in the radioactive decay law, is what gives us the 4.5 billion years of age for the Earth. Modern creationists suggest that most of the decay that has ever occurred happened during the creation week and during the flood. And given they only have 6,000 years to work with, this decay has to be seriously accelerated. According to conventional science, accelerated decay does not happen in nature and cannot happen substantially at all.
So now she's getting it. She's finally starting to get. I really thought she was gonna, define it earlier in this video. I might have the wrong video, but nevertheless, I think you're starting to understand what the heat problem is. Right? It's the heat created by that radioactive decay, the heat created by tectonic movement, the heat created by all these various processes, and trying to create a mathematical accommodation for how that heat can occur in 6,000 years without obliterating the planet. And there isn't a known viable way to do it. And they're still struggling to figure that out.
If it did, this would be enormous for the energy industry. Baumgartner and other CPT proponents don't.
What she's talking about specifically right now is uniformitarianism. The idea that universal constants don't change just because you need them to for your religious myth to make sense. The universal constant of nuclear decay does not change. It stays at a consistent rate, and it only changes in highly specific circumstances. And in those specific circumstances where it does change, the change is minute or minuscule at best. It's completely negligible at worst. So even if the decay rate can change to make all this decay appear, even within a 6,000 year timeline, you still have that amount of nuclear decay to account for. And you still therefore have that amount of heat released by the number of cycles it took to produce that amount of daughter product to explain. And creationists can't. They can't explain it on a young Earth timeline. And this is part of why they've been wrestling with this heat problem since like the 90s.
Don't pretend to have a mechanism for it either. But let's say we did have a mechanism and could figure out how to accelerate nuclear decay.
Right. Even if you can accelerate it, you still have the same amount of heat. If anything, accelerating the amount of decay, accelerating the speed at which the decay happens, is going to produce even more heat. It's going to produce more runoff because you're accelerating the process. You remember how when I dumped the water from this thing at an accelerated rate into here, how it splooshed all over the glass and almost destroyed my sweet, beautiful laptop that's been with me through thick and thin? The same thing for radioactive decay. If you try to, slam all this decay into here in a rate of time that is too short, it's going to cause catastrophic problems.
What would happen if you crammed 4.5 billion years of nuclear decay, or even 500 million years worth of nuclear decay, into 1 year? Well, nuclear decay releases heat and radiation. So accelerating nuclear decay results in lethal conditions to a comically insane degree. Friend of the channel, Jordan of the Reasons to Doubt podcast, helped me drum up some math. By taking the heat output today and applying it back in time, we end up with 1.68 times 10 raised 30 joules of energy for major nuclear decay chains over the past 4.5 billion years. This is equivalent to 4.01 times 10 raised 14 1 megaton hydrogen bombs. This means every cubic kilometer gets its own 402 hydrogen bombs, and every square kilometer gets its own 787,884 hydrogen bombs. Some creationists like to take the majority of that 4.5 billion years worth of accelerated nuclear decay and stick it into the creation week on like day 3 before God creates any living things. So God makes the planet, accelerates the nuclear decay, artificially aging the Earth, and then sticks all the living things on that planet. Of course, they can only take this so far because they do propose that the flood is responsible for at least 500 million years worth of the geologic column.
I got to give some points to Erica here. The way that she takes creationists' ideas, which are often bordering on slapstick with how silly and ridiculous they are, and she steelmans them and takes them seriously. She's really good at doing that. It's one of the reasons I like her. I do not get the sense that she just wants to be mean to creationists. I sometimes want to be mean to creationists because I see them as, liars and deceivers and false prophets and often generally not very good people. But I think Erica actually is less motivated by aggression towards these groups of people as she is by compassion. She actually wants to help these people. She wants to help them understand. I do also want to help them. I do also want to guide their understanding towards something more accurate, but I don't put that much stock in the possibility of doing that. I think generally, psychologically speaking, maybe 1 in 20 people is capable of changing their mind if you give them a really good argument to do so. The vast majority of people, I would say 90 to 95% of people, once they have an ossified belief, it's just set. They're not going to question it. They're not even going to try to look for alternate ideas. It's more comfortable to have an idea that you feel is settled and supported, and that's it. You don't have to think about it anymore. Erica is a very altruistic person, I can tell. She cares about these people and she wants to teach them. The problem is, I don't think the people that she wants to teach generally want to learn.
So in that case, the most that they can stick into the creation week is about 4 billion years, leaving 500 million years.
Oh my gosh, right? And it's like such a contrivance, such an accommodation to say, oh, well, that decay happened in the creation week. That's when that happened. It accelerated for no reason, happened in the creation week for no reason, decelerated for no reason, and is now at the rate it is modernly for no reason. There's no explanation at any stage for how this is an actual workable model for the Earth. And I think that's because it's not trying to be. It's not trying to be that. It's trying to be something that the deeply religious can tell themselves in a vacuum of ignorance so that they don't feel like their beliefs are the same as other myths that are as easy to disprove with basic logic as theirs is. Like, none of us really believe that, Odin killed the ice giants. It didn't happen. Even if you are an actual follower of a Norse religion, that is obviously just a parable. It's a story meant to impart a lesson. Creationists have lost sight of that in their own religion. They have lost sight of the allegory and literary device aspect of their religious text. They are looking at it like it's a history text. And that is just so wildly untenable, so perilously, preposterously flawed that it ends up producing problems like this, where if you try to take it seriously and try to say, okay, this could be the case, and then you go out and you make natural observations and you go, wait a minute, this is an awful lot of nuclear decay to happen in that span of time. How did that happen? It doesn't really work. She likes to say, it's perilously flawed. I think those two words are a great descriptor for it. Perilously flawed, indeed.
Worth of accelerated nuclear decay for the flood. So how much heat do you get from just 500 million years worth of accelerated nuclear decay? We just have to take 1/9 of our.
Spoiler, it's still an ungodly, unconscionable amount. It's still a lethal amount, a comically lethal amount. It's so much heat that it would melt the planet more than a dozen times over, boil all the oceans. It would turn Earth into a superheated plasma hotter than the surface of the sun. This is what she means when she says it's comically lethal. It is comical how lethal it is, how much heat it is. This is what you get when you beg a conclusion and then you find data that doesn't fit that conclusion, but you don't want to throw the conclusion out. You got to come up with some comical contrivances to keep your conclusion in place. And it often ends up producing problems.
Initial number. 500 million years worth of decay is 1.86 times 10 raised 29 joules and equivalent to 4.45 times 10 raised 13 hydrogen bombs. This is equivalent to 87,237 H bombs per square kilometer.
It's almost 100,000 nuclear bombs. So many more nuclear bombs than is necessary for anything. You got one nuclear bomb and you got a major problem. 100,000. Oh my god. You gotta stop, girl. You're killing me. Oh, keep going.
To put it another way, University of Florida geologist Joe Muir did his own math and showed that the thermal gradient, if you start accelerated nuclear decay at creation, you end up with an immediate 65,000 degrees Celsius per kilometer, which cools to a nice 40,000 degrees Celsius per kilometer by the time Noah's flood occurs, and 400 degrees Celsius per kilometer by Jesus' birth. This is 13 to 14 times hotter than the surface of the sun. Oh, but those are mean.
It's such a comically large amount of heat. They started creation week. I still can't get it down to cooler than the surface of the sun. You know what you do when you encounter a problem like that? If you're a real scientist or you're a real mathematician, you go, oh, this doesn't make any sense. This model must be wrong. Not creationists. They have tenacity that I think the world's greatest athletes could envy. Oh my gosh, they don't give up ever. It doesn't matter how comically flawed their model is. It doesn't matter if there's hundreds of nuclear bombs standing between them and a viable model. They will put their head down and try to just plow through it. Oh man, keep going, Erica.
In secular numbers, what are the young Earth creationists saying about their own models? Well, geologist Andrew Snelling, who's worked at Answers in Genesis, has given up some numbers for accelerated nuclear decay, and he does give himself a little bit more leeway, starting the accelerated nuclear decay at 500 million years ago, or rather 500 million years worth of accelerated nuclear decay during Noah's flood, which gets you a temperature of 22,000 degrees Celsius per kilometer during Noah's flood, which is, of course, still completely untenable. Institute for Creation Research member Dr. Larry Vardman notes the amount of heat produced by a decay rate 1,000,000 times faster than normal during the year of the flood could potentially vaporize Earth's oceans, melt the crust, and obliterate the
This is their own. This is their own assessment of their own ideas. The creationists themselves are saying this doesn't work to a comical degree so immense that trying to make it work ends up with the planet getting melted into a puddle. This is their own people. Oh my God. I love this heat problem thing. Oh, it's so funny. Every aspect of it is just hilarious to me.
Surface of the Earth. In fact, Vardman's right, because we have the brute numbers for what it would take energy-wise to boil off the oceans or vaporize them off instantly. To get all the oceans boiling, we need 5.6 times 10 raised 26 joules, and to vaporize them off instantly, we need 3.7 times 10 raised 27 joules. Both our 4.5 billion number of accelerated nuclear decay and our 500 million number of
I love how she's doing this like super complicated math using scientific notation, using extremely high numbers. You pretty much have to use scientific notation with these numbers because they're so immense. But she just puts this little greater than sign. That's all you need to know is this number is way bigger than this number. This number is orders of magnitude larger than these numbers.
Accelerated nuclear decay easily get us there. Okay, so accelerated nuclear decay alone makes Noah's Ark impossible, but we actually have more heat to get rid of. Because you have to take all of the impact events, like the meteor that killed all of the dinosaurs.
I love you, Erica. But wait, there's more.
From the past 500 million years, and those have to happen during the flood too, since the flood is responsible for that whole column. So let's add up the heat generated from the top 10, let's say, impact events of the past 500 million years. Using relatively conservative numbers, we get 4.47 times 10 raised 26 joules of energy, equivalent to another 99 billion hydrogen bombs. This number comes from my physics friend, Dakota. So let's talk about limestone next, because there is an absolute shit tons worth of limestone on this planet, and we need an explanation for it because it's all during that past 500 million years worth of time.
Okay, I've been going for 45 minutes now with my girl Erica here, and she hasn't even laid out all the heat yet. And I think that's more than enough to demonstrate that the heat problem is very real, that if anything, the heat problem is worse than what we currently think it is. And I think that's huge for a couple of reasons. One, some creationists admit that they need the heat. Like Dr. Jason Lyle says, actually, we need the heat. We do have the heat problem because we need the heat a little bit, at least. We need to first have the heat, and then we need to reject it. And the reason for that is because they need the tectonic plates to move at those race car speeds. And you can't do that without some sort of heat. It's inescapable. The equation has to balance. It's impossible for it not to. So either way, you have to have the heat to get the tectonic movement started. So they do have the heat problem. So that's the first reason it's big, is because they have the heat problem, and some of their most authoritative sources accept that they do. The second thing that's big about it is they can't solve the heat problem. They can't solve it. They're never going to solve it. I don't care what they say. I don't care how optimistic you want to try to be. They're not going to solve this problem. It's mathematically impossible. To try and do so just doesn't even make sense. If you are a rational person, what you do when you see this problem is you say, oh, well, the world's not young, so there is no heat problem. And truly, that is the case. There is no heat problem because the world is not 6,000 years old. The world is billions of years old, allowing for that radioactive decay to add up without it being a rate of heat displacement that nukes the planet several billion times over. Oh, so they have the heat problem. They're never going to solve it. And they can only postulate 3 real solutions for it. And I think it's interesting because these 3 solutions are kind of the creationist across the board solutions. They employ one or some combination of these 3 solutions to virtually every problem that plagues their worldview. And those 3 solutions are inventing a deceitful God. They assume that God made a universe that looks old just because. Why? Mess with us, test our faith. It doesn't make any sense because in such a scenario, such a God is impossible to tell apart from the freaking devil. If God's using the same playbook as the master of lies, you have a real problem with your worldview. So the people who came up with the heat problem characterized it. They were a group of creationists called the Rate Team, and this was one of the solutions they put forth, and they rejected it because they didn't like it. I don't want a deceitful God, and I can't blame them. I don't want a deceitful God either. The second solution, the potential invention of exotic future superphysics. And what that means is some creationists are young earth creationists. Other brands of creationists don't have this problem, especially if they're old earth or some other version that doesn't postulate the earth is young. Young earth creationists, one of the ways they're trying to tackle with the heat problem, they're trying to wrestle with the heat problem. Had a couple of drinks. One of the ways they tried to wrestle with it is they've tried to say, oh, maybe we'll find some cooling processes. Maybe this amount of heat can be rejected, and it actually won't be a problem for our worldview. And that doesn't work either because there is simply too much heat. Several billions or trillions of atom bombs worth of heat. And they've done the math. Even with the most contrived superphysics cooling process, something they called mega hurricanes, literally ejecting tidal waves of heat into space every second. It's an incredible amount of heat that it rejects, but it's not even a percent of the heat. And this is one superphysics cooling method, not even getting close to actually, mitigating the tidal wave of heat that they have to deal with. It's a process that there's absolutely no evidence that it ever happens anywhere in nature. They're just making it up prima facie because they have this heat they have to explain away somehow. And it doesn't even get close. It gets so it produces such a minuscule amount of heat rejection that it mathematically invalidates superphysics as a possible solution. Because even if you are to assume that mega hurricanes are possible, absolutely no evidence there is, even if you were to assume that there's hundreds or thousands of other processes like mega hurricanes that can reject, phenomenal amounts of heat, even with thousands of them, you still aren't even cooler than the surface of the sun. The earth is still, even if you introduce 1,000 different types of mega hurricane level cooling processes, earth is still a superheated plasma, and everything on the surface is dead. It's fried by heat and radioactivity, right? So the superphysics process doesn't work. So deceiver God, gone. Superphysics, gone. And that leaves them with their current solution. Miracle. It was magic, dude. God changed the decay rate. He scooped all the heat up with his godly pooper scooper and flung it into space, and everything was fine. If you have to invoke a magical spell to make your model work, your model doesn't work, for one. And for 2, it sure as crap ain't science. It's never going to be science to say miracles is the answer. So that's the heat problem. That's why it knocks young Earth creationism down. That's why they'll never solve it. And that's why I think young Earth creationism will probably be dead in a couple more decades. That's my wildest hope and dream. So I am going to be talking about this heat problem some more. This is just the introductory video explaining to you what it is and why young Earth creationism is so sweatily coping over it. Like, I think Donnie's made a dozen videos about it. You know, there's a whole subsection of creationists who all they do is talk about the heat problem, like Walt Brown and Baumgartner and a couple of other different people Erica was talking about in this video. And they're still not even close. They're not close to solving it, and I don't think they will ever solve it. I would be willing to bet small fortunes or body parts that I care about that they're never going to solve the heat problem. You can't solve it. It doesn't work. And the reason why is because the premise that the Earth is so young is just inescapably wrong. So that's the heat problem. This is my short first video about it that ended up being almost an hour long. I hope you learned what the heat problem is pretty well from this video. Feel free to comment if you have any questions. I'm not really the heat problem expert, but I've learned a lot about it from Erica, and I can at the very least pass your questions on to her if I can't answer them. Yeah, so that's the heat problem. Anyways, thanks for listening to me prattle on about it, and thanks for stopping by.